Professor James Dooley, Baldevan Rangaraju, the author of this excellent book, Mr. Kucharan Das, a friend of mine, a leading intellectual and author, and the organizers of today's function. I'm indeed grateful that I'm having this opportunity to have some exchange of thoughts on what I believe is a truly remarkable study. Just before we began this formal session, I asked the author, why was Patna selected? And how come Patna became the city of this intensive study? Well, partly because I believe, James, you had been to Patna and you encouraged the author to select Patna. Also because you came perhaps to the conclusion that Patna, which was the capital of a basket state, had begun to show signs of change, and therefore it was good really to capture some of this stuff when change was taking place with the vastly improved governance structure than Bihar had traditionally been used to. And so indeed I am grateful also that such a study has been undertaken, which I am sure is in the nature of a pilot study and deserves to be replicated in other cities in somewhat altered context. Of course, James, you have mentioned that cross-country comparisons suggest that by and large the outcome and the recommendations have a robust international bearing, and that cross-country comparisons suggest that these are repetitive patterns and not could be regarded as in any way an episodic aberration, if I may use that expression. But I think that given the methodology used in your study, of course, is capable of refinement, and one could use a somewhat different approach. One can also disagree with some of the findings, but I think that the core finding of your study really in many ways, from the viewpoint of policymakers, upturns the basic thrust of the Right to Education Act. I intervened in that debate in Parliament, and I did point out that whereas this legislation on the right to education had been greatly delayed, indeed, the constitutional obligation to give to the right to education existed a long time ago. The Supreme Court had pronounced on it several years ago, and government seemed to be under pressure to implement not only a constitutional obligation, but the findings of the Supreme Court. Nonetheless, both in the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Education, of which I am privileged to be a member, and also in the debate in Parliament, I did point out that this legislation had been crafted in haste and was being implemented regardless of fully working out the financial outlays and outcomes it is likely to entail. Take some of the 4 key factors of the Right to Education Act and compare this to what Baldevan you have found out or come to the conclusion in this remarkable study. Take the first one. If the objective of the Right to Education Bill is to ensure that all children in the age group of 6 to 14 receive compulsory and indeed free education, then how does the figure on gross enrollment ratio, the figure on dropout ratios, gel with the kind of findings which are the outcome of such a report? Clearly, therefore, there is some mismatch and asymmetry of data between what the policymakers have concluded to be the likely enrollment ratio, the likely dropout ratio, and what is indeed the reality if these large number of private unaided institutions is to be taken into account. So that is one thing which I think that needs to be reconsidered and thought. Take the other finding in which it prescribes the student-teacher ratio. Now, as you rightly point out in the closing remark which you have made, that Bihar alone would require this mind-boggling number of teachers, 3 lakh teachers to be recruited and 28,000 crore to be the likely outcome. Indeed, when Mr. Nitish Kumar had come to power initially, in his first term, we did recruit over 1,25,000 teachers, 50% of which were women, particularly the teachers for primary education. It was not easy to find these many teachers. So many of them, of course, were what is known as para teachers. They could have been taken on contract basis and really learning on the job as you go along. Clearly, the fact that you have found teacher attendance to be 90% in these private and aided institutions suggests that there is a large pool of teachers which remains untapped, and that I think the approach on teacher training and teacher attendance in school needs to undergo a tectonic shift than the approach which you seem to have been following so far. So I think that the whole issue of teacher recruitment, teacher training, teacher attendance is one area where I think that we deserve really a further and careful consideration. The third important finding, I think that which this report would seek us to revisit, is a general proposition that government schools, by the fact of having much better paid teachers, much better quality of infrastructure, would really result in outcomes which are superior than not the high-end private schools, but certainly better than private, unaided private schools, particularly at the lower end. Now, this seems to be in sharp contradiction to the findings of the ASA report, on which, James, you seem to be now focusing on, because clearly outlays and outcomes have a huge mismatch. Clearly, at the end of 5 years of compulsory training, if what kids have been able to learn is inadequate in terms of simple arithmetic, in terms of simple reading, and in terms of a basic grasp of vocabulary, which would be critical for calling them literate. How come, therefore, that in private unaided low-end schools, the outcome and teaching quality is vastly better than government institutions? The fourth or fifth important area where I think we deserve to have a second look. What does the Right to Education Bill do to private teaching institutions in general? Clearly, the Right to Education Bill had little place for private institutions, not only by the fact of the reservation formula, but in terms of the manner in which the cost of teaching is designed to be compensated. Now, government believes, obviously, and falsely so in my view, that government would be in a position to fulfill the major gap in terms of meeting the obligations of the state for primary education. There is a right to universal secondary education bill, which I believe is on the anvil. We are vastly expanding in terms of the higher end, since the gross enrollment ratio right now is tantalizingly close to 12%, and we intend to raise the gross enrollment ratio to 25%, which means basically as of now today, 88% children who leave the higher secondary, only 12% are really pursuing higher education. 88% in some are students who are not pursuing higher education. Clearly, if you want to go to global averages, that's mind-boggling. We want to go to even developing emerging country markets, that's also mind-boggling. But the modest expectation of the 12 5-year plan of raising this from 12% to, let us say, 25% involves at least setting up 150,000 more new colleges. Now, the same issues on issues of faculty, teacher training, in terms of outcomes, and so on. And finally, I think I'll raise one more issue and leave it at that. I do not think that the Right to Education bill has fully factored in not only the importance of private entrepreneurial skill and public-private partnership in the area of primary and secondary education, everything which is doing to undercut that is, in my view, a grave disservice. I am of the considered view that sooner than later, this Right to Education bill, enacted in hurry and being implemented by a degree of thoughtlessness and imposing a huge financial onerous obligation on the state, would deserve to be rethought and reworked out. I do believe that this study, which has been undertaken by Baladevan, and which I believe is just one sample study, will be a powerful impetus forcing policymakers and forcing government to rethink some of the settled paradigms in regard to primary and secondary education. In that sense, and more sense than one, this is really a national service which this study has undertaken. Thank you very much.